Here's a psychological trick wealthy people use without even thinking about it. And the fact that you've never heard it explained this way is exactly why you're not using it yet. It's not about budgeting apps. It's not about side hustles. It's something far simpler and far more uncomfortable to hear. Rich people delay identity. Poor people rush it. Think about how often you've seen someone get a small raise, a bonus, or their first real paycheck, and within days something changes about how they spend. Not because they suddenly need more things, but because the money itself felt like permission to become a different version of themselves immediately. That instinct isn't a character flaw. It's one of the most natural psychological reactions a person can have. But it's also the exact reaction that keeps most people financially stuck in the same place for years, even as their income slowly increases. Let me explain what that actually means, and let me show you exactly how this is played out in the lives of people who actually built real wealth. Most people, the moment they get a bit of extra money, immediately upgrade their lifestyle to match how they want to feel. New clothes, a nicer car, a bigger night out. It feels like progress. It feels like proof that things are working. But it's actually the opposite of what wealthy people do at that exact same moment. Wealthy people do something almost boring in comparison. They delay the reward. Not because they don't want it, but because they understand something most people never learn. Spending to feel successful and being successful are two completely different things, and only one of them compounds over time. This is the trick. It's called identity deferral, and it's the single biggest psychological gap between people who build wealth and people who simply look like they have it. Here's what makes this so counterintuitive. We're taught, almost from childhood, that success should look like something, a certain car, a certain neighborhood, a certain way of dressing. So, when someone finally starts making real progress financially, the instinct to display that progress feels less like vanity and more like proof that the hard work actually paid off. The problem is, the moment you convert progress into appearance, that money stops working for you. It stops compounding. It becomes a static decoration instead of a growing asset. And most people never even notice the moment that trade happens, because it feels so natural. There's a story often told about Jim Rohn early in his career, long before he became known as one of the most influential voices in personal development. By his own account in interviews and seminars, he spent much of his 20s working hard but staying financially stuck, not because he lacked effort, but because he hadn't yet learned to separate his spending from his self-image. The turning point, as he described it in his talks for decades afterward, came from a mentor who challenged him with a simple but brutal question. Are you becoming wealthy, or are you just trying to look like someone who already is? That distinction reportedly reshaped how he approached money for the rest of his life, and it became one of the central themes he taught to millions of people in the decades that followed. The idea that discipline in the unseen moments matters more than performance in the visible ones. What's worth sitting with in that story isn't just the lesson itself, but how long it took to learn it. Rohn didn't stumble onto this idea overnight, and he didn't learn it from a book. He learned it because someone older and further along was willing to ask him an uncomfortable question instead of a comfortable one. Most people never get asked that question by anyone, which means most people have to ask it of themselves. And that's exactly what this video is trying to do right now. Here's why this works on a psychological level. To understand why identity deferral works, you have to understand what your brain is actually doing every time you make a purchase tied to status. It's not making a financial calculation, it's making an emotional one, and it's happening faster than conscious thought. Your brain craves identity confirmation. When you buy something that signals success, your brain gets an immediate hit of, "I am that person now." It feels real. It feels earned. But it's borrowed proof. You bought the evidence instead of building the thing the evidence was supposed to represent. Wealthy people short-circuit this craving. They let the discomfort of not looking successful yet sit there, unresolved, sometimes for years, while the actual asset, the business, the investment, the skill, quietly compounds in the background where nobody's watching. This is harder than it sounds, because the discomfort is real. You will see people who started later than you, worked less than you, and understand less than you, driving nicer cars and posting from nicer places, and every part of you will want to close that gap immediately, the visible way. That pull isn't weakness. It's one of the strongest psychological forces a person can experience, because it's tied to how we've measured belonging and status for thousands of years. But here's the part almost nobody says out loud. The people who eventually pull furthest ahead are usually the ones who can tolerate looking for a while like they're falling behind. Not because they don't feel the pull, because they've decided consciously that the visible scoreboard isn't the real one. The real scoreboard is invisible for a long time, and that's exactly why so few people have the patience to keep playing on it. There's an image that captures this better than almost anything else. An iceberg. What you see above the water is maybe 10% of what's actually there. The other 90% sits beneath the surface, unseen, doing the real work of keeping the whole structure upright. Most people, when they look at someone wealthy, are only ever looking at the 10%, the house, the car, the vacation photos. They assume that's the whole iceberg. They try to recreate the 10% they can see, without realizing that the 10% was never the point. It was a byproduct of 90% of work, risk, and patience that happened entirely out of view. This is why copying the visible lifestyle of someone wealthy almost never works. You're not copying the iceberg, you're copying a photograph of the tip of it, while the actual mass that keeps it floating doesn't exist underneath your version at all. Buy the car without the underlying asset, and you haven't built anything. You've just rented the appearance of an iceberg for a few years until the debt comes due. John D. Rockefeller is often cited as someone who understood this distinction with almost unsettling discipline. Multiple biographers and historical accounts describe a man who, even as his oil empire grew into one of the largest fortunes in modern history, lived for long stretches with a level of personal restraint that seemed almost contradictory to his wealth. He reportedly tracked his spending obsessively, down to small personal expenses, long after he had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, not out of necessity, but because the habit of treating money as a tool rather than a trophy had become part of how he thought, not just what he did. What's interesting about accounts like this is that the restraint didn't disappear once the wealth arrived. If anything, it became more deliberate. That's the part most people get backwards. They assume discipline is something you practice until you're rich, and then you get to stop. But for the people who stay wealthy across decades, rather than flaming out after one good year. The discipline doesn't end when the money arrives. It's the thing that was never tied to the money in the first place. It was tied to identity, and identity doesn't expire just because your bank account changed. This is really the heart of everything this video has been circling. The visible parts of wealth, the car, the house, the watch, the vacation, were never the goal for the people who actually built lasting fortunes. They were occasional, almost incidental byproducts of decades spent building something invisible. The moment you start chasing the byproduct directly, skipping the part that actually creates it, you've stepped onto a treadmill that looks like progress but quietly consumes the very resources that could have built the real thing. So the next time you feel that pull, the urge to spend in a way that proves something to someone, including yourself, try asking one question before you act. Am I building the iceberg? Or am I just buying a photograph of someone else's? Picture two trees planted on the same day, side by side. One grows fast in its first year, tall, visible, impressive to anyone walking past. The other barely seems to move, no height to show, nothing for a passerby to admire. But underground, where nobody's looking, that second tree is doing something the first one isn't. It's building roots wide and deep enough to survive a drought, a storm, a decade of bad seasons. 10 years later, the fast-growing tree has often toppled or stalled, while the slow one towers over the entire field. Nobody claps for root growth. There's no applause for what's happening underground. But it's the only part that determines whether anything will still be standing a decade from now. This is, in many ways, exactly what people misunderstand about figures like Andrew Carnegie, who reportedly worked for modest wages for years in his early life, reinvesting what little he had rather than spending it on the trappings of success he could have technically afforded to chase. Accounts of his early career often describe a man who was, by appearances, unremarkable for far longer than his eventual fortune would suggest, because the entire early period of his life was root growth, not branch growth. The branches, the visible wealth, the libraries, the steel empire came only after decades of invisible compounding that nobody outside his closest circle could see or measure. That's the trade everyone chasing invisible success first has to confront eventually. You can have the branches now, thin and fragile, swaying in every wind, or you can have the roots first, invisible and unimpressive, until one day they're not. Almost nobody regrets choosing roots 10 years later. Almost everyone who chose branches first eventually wishes they hadn't. Not because nice things are bad, but because borrowed branches without roots underneath them tend to come crashing down the moment the wind picks up. This pattern shows up famously in Warren Buffett's life. It's widely reported that Buffett bought his Omaha house decades ago for a modest price by the standards of someone who would go on to become one of the wealthiest people in the world, and reportedly lived in that same modest house for the rest of his life, long after he could have afforded almost any home on earth. According to interviews and profiles written about him over the years, his reasoning wasn't about being frugal for its own sake. It was about not letting lifestyle inflate to match net worth, because every dollar redirected toward appearance is a dollar no longer compounding toward the actual goal. Whether or not you find that admirable, the pattern is hard to ignore. The wealth came first, and the visible lifestyle barely moved at all. Let's talk about why this trick is so hard to use. even once you know about it. It's hard because humans are wired for social proof, not patience. For most of human history, visible status was tied directly to safety and access to resources. Looking successful used to be a survival mechanism. Your brain hasn't caught up to the modern world, where actual wealth building often requires looking the opposite of successful for years at a time. This is also why so much financial advice fails. Advice that just says save more or spend less ignores the real battle, which is psychological, not mathematical. You're not fighting bad math. You're fighting a brain that wants identity proof right now. Sam Walton, who built Walmart into one of the largest companies in the world, was widely known, according to numerous accounts from people who knew him and journalists who covered him, for driving an old, unremarkable pickup truck for years, even after becoming one of the richest men in America. Visitors who expected to meet someone matching the image of extreme wealth were reportedly often surprised by how ordinary his day-to-day life looked. The lesson people who study his career often draw from this isn't that frugality alone builds empires. It's that he never let his personal lifestyle compete with his business for resources or attention. The truck wasn't the point. What it represented, keeping identity separate from net worth, was the point. So how do you actually use this trick yourself? First, separate spending from identity on purpose. Before a purchase that's about how you'll be perceived rather than what you actually need, ask yourself, am I buying this because it's useful or because I want proof that I've made it? That single question, asked honestly, will change more financial decisions than any app or spreadsheet ever will. Second, get comfortable being underestimated for a while. This is the hardest part. People who build real wealth often go through a period where they look like they're behind. Modest car, modest apartment, nothing flashy, while the real progress is invisible, sitting in investments, skills, or a growing business. If you need external proof that you're winning, this period will feel unbearable. If you can tolerate it, this period is exactly where the gap gets built. Third, let the asset talk eventually, not your lifestyle. Wealthy people eventually do enjoy nice things, but it comes after the asset is built, funded by the asset itself, not financed against a future that hasn't arrived yet. Here's the uncomfortable truth this video is really about. Most people aren't broke because they lack opportunity. They're broke because they keep buying proof of a version of themselves that hasn't been built yet. And every dollar spent on that proof is a dollar that isn't compounding toward becoming the real thing. Rohn used to teach that you should never spend your money before you've earned it, and never spend your future before you've built it. That single idea, repeated to thousands of audiences over his lifetime, is really just another way of describing identity deferral, delaying the appearance of success until the substance of it actually exists. If you've spent years buying the appearance of success instead of the substance of it, this isn't a moral failure. It's a psychological pattern almost everyone falls into, because almost nobody explains it this clearly. The good news is, the moment you can see the pattern, you can start interrupting it. Subscribe to Avexora for more breakdowns like this. The psychology behind money, success, and the mindset shifts that actually move the needle. Not just the advice that sounds good, but changes nothing. Comment identity below if this hit different, and let me know what you've been buying that was really just proof instead of progress. This is Avexora. Money, success, facts, growth. Think bigger, grow faster. See you in the next one.